The moment a space marine is declared a heretic represents one of the most catastrophic failures imaginable within the rigid hierarchies of the Imperium. These transhuman warriors are intended to be humanity's most incorruptible defenders, genetically engineered angels of death whose conditioning should render them immune to the whispers of darkness that tempt lesser men. Yet history has proven again and again that even angels can fall. When they do, the Imperium's response is absolute. There is no mercy, no redemption, no second chances. The declaration of excommunicate traitoris is not merely an administrative designation, but a sentence of total annihilation that encompasses body, soul, and memory. The process begins with suspicion. Within the paranoid structure of the Imperium, where survival depends upon eternal vigilance against threats both external and internal, even Space Marine chapters are subject to scrutiny. The Inquisition maintains constant observation of every chapter, monitoring for signs of corruption, deviation from established doctrine, or behavior that might indicate compromise by the forces of chaos. This surveillance operates on multiple levels. Inquisitorial agents may embed themselves within chapter support structures, observing from positions as menial as medkey staff or ship crew. Fellow Space Marine chapters report unusual behavior. Imperial Guard commanders file complaints when Astarte's forces fail to coordinate properly or demonstrate concerning tactical choices. Even the Ecclesiarchy watches these secular warriors, alert for any sign that their faith in the Emperor might be wavering. For many chapters, the path to heresy begins not with open rebellion, but with small compromises, pragmatic decisions made in the heat of battle, or the desperation of impossible circumstances. The Realitors chapter exemplified this gradual descent. Originally founded as the Fire Claws during the Age of Apostasy, they were designated as one of the Astartes praises, elite chapters specifically created to guard against threats emerging from the Eye of Terror. Their mission placed them on the front lines against chaos itself, fighting daily battles against demon-possessed monstrosities and traitor legions that had been waging war for 10,000 years. In this crucible of constant warfare, the Relictors began to adopt what they considered necessary tactics. If a Chaos Space Marine wielded a demon weapon of terrible power, why destroy it when it could be turned against the enemy? If corrupted artifacts held secrets that might help defeat the ruinous powers, was it not logical to study them, to understand the enemy's capabilities? This philosophy, known among certain radical elements of the Inquisition as Xanthism, advocated using the tools of chaos against itself. Named after Inquisitor Zaranchek Xanthus, who was himself executed as a heretic in the 32nd millennium, Xanthism held that victory against chaos required adopting its weapons while maintaining spiritual purity through strength of will and faith in the Emperor. The Relictors embraced this doctrine completely. Their librarians became experts in identifying and containing chaos artifacts. Their armory accumulated weapons torn from the hands of defeated traitors. Their warriors trained in the use of demon blades, force axes powered by captured warp entities, and armour inscribed with protective runes that danced perilously close to forbidden sigils. For decades, perhaps even centuries, this approach seemed to work. The Relictors achieved victory after victory against forces that destroyed other chapters. Their battle record was exemplary, their dedication to the Emperor's cause unquestionable. But the Imperium does not measure loyalty by results. It measures loyalty by adherence to doctrine, by rigid compliance with 10,000 years of accumulated religious and military tradition. When a cell of Inquisitors discovered the extent of the Relictors' artifact collection, their response was immediate and overwhelming. 4 chapter masters, commanding the combined strength of 4 entire Space Marine chapters, arrived at the Relictors' Fortress Monastery alongside an Emperor-class battleship, one of the most massive warships in the Imperial Navy. The implied threat was unmistakable. Surrender the artifacts and the personnel responsible for their acquisition, or face total annihilation. Faced with this ultimatum, the Relictors had no choice. Their chapter master, their chief librarian Decario, and the radical Inquisitor Demarche, who had encouraged their philosophy, were all handed over to Imperial authorities. The Relictors watched as Demarche was executed for heresy. Decario simply disappeared into inquisitorial custody, his fate unknown but undoubtedly grim. Their accumulated artifacts, representing generations of careful collection and study, were confiscated and presumably destroyed. As penance for their transgressions, the entire Relictor chapter was sent on a century-long penitent crusade. This was not declared heresy, not yet. This was the Imperium's version of mercy, a chance for the Relictors to prove through blood and sacrifice that they remained loyal servants of the Emperor. The entire chapter, all 10 companies comprising nearly 1,000 Space Marines, deployed to Armageddon during the Third War for that embattled world. They were assigned to fight feral orc tribes in the equatorial jungles, dangerous work but theoretically straightforward. Yet even during their penance, the Relictors could not entirely abandon their methods. Rather than focusing on the assigned mission of orc extermination, the majority of the chapter concentrated their efforts around a corrupted monument known as Angron's Monolith. This structure, a twisted pyramid dedicated to the chaos god Khorne, radiated such powerful warp energies that the surrounding region had been declared purgatus, quarantined from all Imperial forces. The Relictors saw opportunity where others saw only corruption. Their chief librarian Ephesus believed the monolith contained fragments of a demon weapon once wielded by Angron himself, the demon primarch of the World Eater's traitor legion. Such an artifact could potentially be used against the forces of chaos, turned into a weapon for the Imperium's defense. This single-minded obsession with chaos artifacts, even during what was supposed to be a period of atonement and purification, demonstrated to Imperial authorities that the Relictors had not learned the lesson their punishment was meant to teach. When the 13th Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror, led by Abaddon the Despoiler, the Relictors again positioned themselves at the forefront of resistance. They fought bravely, achieving significant victories against overwhelming chaos forces. But they also continued to collect artifacts from defeated enemies, adding to hidden caches that Imperial observers noted with growing alarm. Reports reached the Inquisition of unorthodox teachings spreading through the chapter's librarium, of weapons that radiated warp signatures being openly carried into battle, of tactics that seemed to embrace rather than resist the corrupting influence of the Eye of Terror. The final straw came during a raid on the Diomedes Archive, a remote inquisitorial facility that housed chaos artifacts deemed too dangerous for destruction, but too valuable for loss. The Relictors attacked this installation not as enemies of the Imperium, but as warriors pursuing what they considered a necessary tactical objective. In their minds, they were securing a weapon that could help turn the tide against Abaddon's Black Crusade. In the Imperium's eyes, they had crossed the final line, attacking Imperial forces to steal forbidden artifacts. The distinction between using chaos weapons to fight chaos and becoming tools of chaos themselves had been obliterated. The Inquisition's judgment was swift and unanimous. The Relictors were declared extremis diabolus, the highest level of heretical corruption, and proclaimed excommunicate traitoris by the Ordo Hereticus. The declaration itself follows a precise bureaucratic process, though the consequences are anything but bureaucratic. When either the High Lords of Terror or an Inquisitor of sufficient authority pronounces judgment, the accused individual or organization is immediately struck from the annals of Imperial history. The Historical Revision Unit of the Administratum dispatches specialized deletion teams whose sole purpose is to erase every trace of the condemned from official records. Their names are deleted from the scrolls of honor in the Hall of Heroes within the Imperial Palace itself. The vast databases of the Librarium Terra, containing information on every significant Imperial citizen and organization, accumulated over 10 millennia, are purged of all references. If the condemned is a Space Marine chapter, the Adeptus Mechanicus destroys their gene seed stores, ensuring that no future warriors can be created bearing their genetic legacy. This erasure extends beyond mere documentation. The Imperium practices a form of damnatio memoria so absolute that even speaking the name of the condemned becomes heresy. Monuments are torn down, statues defaced, murals painted over. Picked recordings are destroyed. Any Imperial citizen who refuses to forget, who maintains records or speaks fondly of the fallen, risks being declared complicit in their heresy. This total erasure serves multiple purposes. Practically, it prevents others from following the condemned's example, denying them the martyrdom of history. Spiritually, it represents the Imperium's absolute rejection of their existence, a theological statement that they never truly served the Emperor at all. The message is unmistakable. Heresy does not simply result in death, but in the complete annihilation of everything one ever was or accomplished. For Space Marines specifically, additional protocols apply. If any of the condemned Astartes are slain, their bodies must be completely incinerated so that no trace of their gene seed can be recovered or misused. This represents a profound horror for Space Marine chapters, whose entire culture revolves around the reverence of gene seed as a physical link to their Primarch, and through him to the Emperor himself. The progenoid glands, special organs implanted in every Space Marine that store and mature gene seed for the creation of new warriors, are the chapter's most precious resource. Entire campaigns have been fought to recover gene seed from fallen battle brothers, ensuring that their genetic legacy continues even after physical death. For condemned heretics, even this final dignity is denied. Their bodies are reduced to ash, their genetic material destroyed, ensuring that nothing of them persists beyond memory. The Soul Drinkers. Chapter experienced this condemnation despite never truly embracing chaos worship. Originally created as a successor to the Imperial Fist during the Second Founding, the Soul Drinkers served with distinction for millennia. Their fall began not with corruption, but with disillusionment. During a campaign to recover a sacred artifact, Chapter Master Sarpedon discovered evidence that the artifact had been stolen, not by enemies of the Imperium, but by corrupt elements within the Imperium itself. This revelation shattered his faith in the institutions that governed mankind, though not in the Emperor. When inquisitorial forces arrived to reclaim the artifact and execute the Soul Drinkers for knowing too much about internal Imperial corruption, Sarpedon refused to comply. His chapter scattered their fleet and went renegade, not in service to chaos, but in pursuit of what they believed to be the Emperor's true vision, uncorrupted by 10,000 years of bureaucratic decay. Unknown to Sarpedon, a demon prince of Tzinch named Abraxas had orchestrated these events, manipulating the chapter master's righteous anger and sense of betrayal. While the Soul Drinkers fled Imperial authority, Abraxas worked to corrupt them from within, introducing subtle mutations that began warping their physical forms. 8-legged spider mutations emerged among the Battle Brothers, transforming proud warriors into chitinous monstrosities. The Soul Drinkers' apothecaries struggled to understand and combat these changes, believing them to be some flaw in their gene seed awakened by stress and combat. Only when Abraxas revealed himself and offered the chapter a place as his personal warband of Chaos Space Marines did Sarpedon understand the extent to which they had been manipulated. To his credit, the chapter master refused, attacking the demon prince and ultimately destroying him despite the overwhelming power disparity. But refusal to serve Chaos did not grant redemption in the Imperium's eyes. The Soul Drinkers had been declared excommunicate traitoris. They had attacked Imperial forces, stolen Imperial property, and been exposed to corrupting influences that rendered them spiritually suspect regardless of their intentions. The Inquisition dispatched multiple task forces to hunt them down. Space Marine chapters, particularly the Imperial Fists from whom the Soul Drinkers descended, considered it a matter of honor to eliminate these fallen brothers. For years, the Soul Drinkers fought a desperate guerrilla war against everyone, battling chaos forces that sought to exploit their isolation, while simultaneously evading Imperial hunters who would grant them no mercy. The Soul Drinkers' ultimate fate demonstrated the Imperium's absolute position on heresy. Eventually captured by the Imperial Fists, the surviving Soul Drinkers were brought aboard the Phalanx, the massive mobile fortress monastery of Rogel Dawn's Legion. There, they faced trial. This was not mercy but adherence to tradition, the Imperial Fist's sense of honor demanding that their errant successors receive proper judgment before execution. The trial was exhaustive, examining every action the Soul Drinkers had taken since their fall from grace. Evidence was presented of battles against Imperial forces, of alliance with Xenos species, of exposure to warp corruption. The prosecution's case was overwhelming and damning. Yet throughout the proceedings, Chapter Master Sarpedon maintained that his warriors had never abandoned the Emperor, only the corrupt institutions claiming to serve him. This distinction meant nothing legally but everything to the condemned Marines themselves, who faced extinction believing they had remained loyal to humanity's true protector, even as the Imperium itself turned against them. The process of declaring a Space Marine or chapter heretical reveals much about the Imperium's fundamental nature. It is not a government concerned with justice in any recognizable sense, but a theocratic military dictatorship obsessed with doctrinal purity and absolute obedience. Results matter less than adherence to protocol. A chapter that achieves overwhelming success through unorthodox methods is more suspect than a chapter that fails while following established doctrine. Innovation is heresy, adaptation is weakness. The only safe path is rigid compliance with traditions established during the Great Crusade, 10,000 years in the past, regardless of whether those traditions remain relevant to current threats. This calcified rigidity extends to how the Imperium evaluates intent versus action. The Relictors genuinely believed they were fighting for humanity's survival when they collected Chaos artifacts. The Soul Drinkers genuinely believed they were serving the Emperor's vision when they rejected the corrupt Imperium that claimed his authority. Neither chapter's intentions mattered when judgment came. The Imperium recognizes no difference between a warrior who falls to chaos deliberately and one who is pushed toward heresy by circumstances beyond their control. The taint of chaos is absolute. Corruption is corruption, and exposure is damnation regardless of whether one actively sought it or desperately fought against it. This absolutism reflects the Imperium's existential understanding of chaos as a threat. The ruinous powers do not require willing servants to corrupt souls. Mere exposure can plant seeds of damnation that blossom years or decades later. A warrior who carries a demon weapon, even with the purest intentions, risks having that weapon's imprisoned entity whisper corruption into their thoughts during unguarded moments. An Astartes who studies forbidden lore to better combat chaos may find that knowledge reshaping their psychology in subtle ways, making arguments for compromise where none should exist. The Imperium's paranoid response to even minor deviations stems from 10,000 years of experience, watching how corruption spreads, how small compromises lead to larger ones, how the path to damnation is often paved with noble intentions. When the Grey Knights, the Imperium's most elite demon hunters, received orders to destroy the Relictors, they did so without hesitation or mercy. Under the command of Inquisitor Chiaro of the Order Malleus, these incorruptible warriors descended upon the Relictors' hidden anchorage in the Taloth system. The battle was catastrophically one-sided. The Grey Knights are purpose-built for fighting chaos in all its forms, equipped with weapons and armor that make them anathema to demonic entities. Their training focuses specifically on identifying and eliminating corruption, wherever it hides. Against them, the Relictors stood no chance. Ship after ship was boarded and purged. Marines who had fought for centuries in the Emperor's service died screaming prayers of loyalty that went unheard by executioners who saw only heretics deserving of death. The few hundred survivors managed to escape only because Inquisitor Chiaro allowed it. Whether this was incompetence, mercy, or something more sinister remains unknown. Some theorize that the Inquisitor, himself a suspected radical, deliberately let certain Relictors escape to continue their work, collecting Chaos artifacts, believing their methodology had value despite its heretical nature. Others suggest the Grey Knights simply found it tactically impossible to completely annihilate a force of transhuman warriors fighting with the desperation of the condemned. Regardless, the survivors fled into the Eye of Terror itself, that massive warp storm where the boundaries between reality and the immaterium blur. There, they vanish from reliable Imperial records. Whether they maintain their struggle to fight chaos on its own terms, whether they have finally succumbed to the corruption they so long resisted, or whether they simply survive as broken remnants of a once proud chapter, none can say with certainty. The declaration process also encompasses lone heretics, individual space marines who fall to darkness while their chapter remains loyal. These cases present different challenges. A single corrupted Astartes lacks the resources and support structure of an entire chapter, but also represents a more targeted threat. Individual heretics often arise from specific traumatic incidents. A librarian who delves too deeply into forbidden lore might find himself seduced by promises of power. A chaplain whose faith wavers in the face of overwhelming horror might hear the whispers of chaos offering meaning to suffering. A battle brother who witnesses the deaths of all his squad mates might be approached by demons, offering revenge and the strength to prevent future losses. When corruption is discovered at the individual level, chapters typically handle judgment internally. Space Marine chapters maintain their own hierarchies, their own justice systems, their own methods of dealing with failure and betrayal. A battle brother who shows signs of taint will be brought before the chapter's chaplains and librarians for examination. If corruption is confirmed but deemed early enough to potentially reverse, the Marine might be subjected to extreme penitent rituals, psychic cleansing, or isolation and meditation intended to strengthen his resistance. If the taint has progressed beyond redemption, execution by the battle brother's own chapter is often considered preferable to allowing the Inquisition to become involved. This represents mercy of a sort, allowing the warrior to die among those who knew him, who remember what he was before corruption claimed him, who will ensure his gene seed is handled with appropriate reverence rather than destroyed as heretical material. However, not all corrupted individuals allow themselves to be judged. Some flee their chapters, becoming lone heretics hunted by their former brothers. These renegades are particularly dangerous because they retain all their transhuman capabilities and military training, while lacking the resources and support that make chapters vulnerable to large-scale Imperial response. A lone Chaos Space Marine can hide among human populations, corrupting entire planetary sectors through careful manipulation before disappearing into the void. They can wage campaigns of terror that devastate regions without ever facing the massed firepower that would destroy a chapter fleet. The Imperium dedicates enormous resources to hunting these individuals, deploying inquisitorial strike teams, Death Watch kill teams, and sometimes entire chapters to track down and eliminate single corrupted Astartes. The actual moment of declaration, when an Inquisitor or the High Lords formally pronounce judgment, carries weight beyond legal authority. Within the warp, where thought and reality intertwine, such pronouncements have metaphysical consequences. The accumulated faith of trillions of Imperial citizens, their absolute belief in the Emperor's authority and the righteousness of his judgments, creates psychic resonance. When the Imperium declares someone excommunicate Traitoris, that declaration reverberates through the warp itself. Entities that feed on despair and betrayal take notice. Demons that specialize in corrupting the loyal suddenly find new targets marked by Imperial condemnation. The declared heretic, even if they have resisted all actual corruption, suddenly finds themselves assaulted by warp entities, drawn to the psychic signature of official condemnation. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where the accusation of heresy makes actual corruption more likely, as the accused finds themselves cut off from the Emperor's protection and besieged by the very forces they are accused of serving. This metaphysical dimension of heresy explains why the Imperium is so reluctant to declare Space Marine chapters heretical, even when evidence of corruption exists. Every such declaration weakens humanity's psychic defenses, creating rifts in the collective faith that shields mankind from warp predation. It admits that the Emperor's finest warriors, his incorruptible angels, can fail. This admission damages morale across the Imperium, creates doubt in the minds of common soldiers who look to Space Marines as living proof of the Emperor's power. The Inquisition weighs carefully before declaring Astartes heretics, knowing that each such judgment carries cost beyond the immediate military consequences of losing a chapter's combat capability. Yet despite this reluctance, declarations continue because the alternative is worse. An openly corrupted chapter that is not condemned represents a cancer within the Imperium's military structure. Other chapters watch how the Imperium responds to heresy. If corruption is overlooked or forgiven, it sends the message that deviation from doctrine might be acceptable, that loyalty is negotiable, that the ancient compact between Space Marines and the Emperor can be reinterpreted based on circumstances. This cannot be permitted. The Imperium survives on rigid adherence to established truth, on unquestioning acceptance of doctrine developed over 10 millennia. Any crack in that foundation threatens the entire structure. Better to lose 1,000 chapters to overcautious purging than to allow a single truly corrupted chapter to continue operating with Imperial authority. The transformation begins in ways too subtle to notice. Brother Tarkus of the Relictors felt it first as a tingling warmth, where the demon blade touched his gauntlet, a sensation that should have been impossible through ceramite and the black carapace interface beneath his skin. The sword whispered constantly now, not in words but in emotions, urges that felt almost like his own thoughts. Strike harder, take risks, claim glory. Such thoughts were not entirely alien to a Space Marine, whose conditioning emphasized aggression and the pursuit of victory. That was the insidious genius of corruption. It did not announce itself as an external force, but masqueraded as the warrior's own nature amplified, desires he already possessed given greater voice. By the time Tarkus realized these thoughts originated from something outside himself, tendrils of warp energy had already begun rewriting the very structure of his gene seed, preparing his transhuman body for changes that would render him unrecognizable. The physical transformation of a Space Marine who falls to chaos varies enormously depending on multiple factors. The specific chaos god they serve, whether through deliberate worship or inadvertent exposure, fundamentally shapes how corruption manifests. The duration and intensity of warp exposure accelerates or retards the process. Most critically, the individual's own will, their acceptance or resistance of the changes, determines whether transformation occurs over centuries or instantaneously. Some warriors maintain nearly human appearance for decades while their minds slowly rot from within. Others undergo catastrophic mutation in moments, their bodies unable to contain the flood of warp energy coursing through transhuman physiology, never designed to channel such power. For space marines who dedicate themselves to specific chaos gods, transformation follows predictable but terrifying patterns. Those who pledge themselves to Khorne, the blood god, find their already formidable combat capabilities enhanced to nightmarish extremes. Muscles swell beyond even Astartes' norms, growing until armor splits and must be replaced with larger variants forged in the eye of Terra's corrupted forges. Skin thickens into something approaching armored hide, red or bronze in coloration, often bearing brass studs that erupt through flesh without the warrior's conscious volition. Horns sprout from skulls, curving backward in mockery of the Emperor's own iconography. The black rage that afflicted certain chapters becomes amplified into something beyond madness, a state of perpetual fury where the only relief comes through violence. These Khornate warriors often lose the capacity for strategic thought entirely, retaining only tactical awareness sufficient to identify and destroy enemies. Their neurological conditioning, designed to allow space marines to function through any pain, is twisted into complete inability to feel anything except the ecstasy of combat. Wounds that would incapacitate normal Astartes barely slow them. Lost limbs are replaced not through surgical intervention, but through warp-spawned growth that erupt from stumps, crude but functional. The World Eater's Legion exemplifies this path. During the Horus Heresy, their Primarch Angron ordered the implantation of cortical devices called the Butcher's Nails into his warriors. These archaeotech implants, recovered from Angron's homeworld of Nuceria, were designed to suppress fear and pain while amplifying aggression. For baseline humans, they induced psychotic bloodlust. For space marines, whose neurological structures were already optimized for war, the nails created warriors of unparalleled ferocity who could only find peace in killing. When the World Eaters fled into the Eye of Terror after their defeat at the Siege of Terra, prolonged exposure to warp energies interacted catastrophically with the Butcher's Nails. The technological implants fused with demonic essence, becoming something neither wholly mechanical nor entirely organic. World Eaters began growing additional organs that secreted combat stimulants directly into their bloodstream. Their brains restructured, sections devoted to memory and personality atrophying, while areas governing motor control and spatial awareness expanded. Many lost the ability to speak coherently, their vocabularies reduced to battle cries and screams of rage, yet they retained all their transhuman combat skill, perhaps even enhanced it, becoming perfect instruments of Khorne's will. Conversely, those who fall to Nurgle, the plague god, undergo transformations defined by decay rather than enhancement. The Death Guard Legion provides the archetypal example. During their journey through the warp toward Terra, the Death Guard fleet became becalmed, trapped in temporal stasis where centuries passed for the trapped marines while only days elapsed in real space. Within their ships, a plague of unprecedented virulence began spreading. It started with minor infections, festering wounds that failed to heal despite Space Marine regenerative capabilities. Then came necrosis, flesh blackening and sloughing away even while the victim remained alive and conscious. Internal organs liquefied, replaced by noxious fluids that somehow sustained life despite all biological logic. The Death Guard's Primarch Mortarion, desperate to save his sons, called out to any power that might hear. Nurgle answered. The Plague God offered salvation, not through cure but through transformation. The diseases ravaging the Legion would cease killing them if they simply accepted Nurgle's blessing, allowing the infections to become permanent rather than terminal. Mortarion agreed. Instantly, the dying ceased, but the transformations continued. Death Guard Marines found their bodies swelling with toxic gases and diseased fluids, their armor splitting to accommodate bloated forms. Organs that should have failed began functioning again, though in ways no Imperial medkey would recognize. Hearts pumped blood thick with infection, lungs filled with miasma that sustained life through means defying biological understanding. Most horrifically, the pain stopped. not because the diseases vanished, but because Nurgle's blessing granted acceptance of suffering, transforming agony into something approaching comfort. The Death Guard became plague marines, warriors who spread contagion wherever they walked, whose very presence poisoned air and water, who viewed disease not as affliction, but as Grandfather Nurgle's gift to the unenlightened. They retained their tactical acumen, their skill with weapons, their space marine discipline. But these capabilities now served only to more effectively spread Nurgle's plagues across the galaxy. The mutations inflicted by Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, prove more varied and unpredictable than those of other gods. Tzeentch values sorcery and ambition, granting power to psychers and schemers willing to pay the price. The Thousand Suns Legion learned this price intimately. Before their fall to chaos, they suffered from a genetic flaw called the flesh change, a condition where mutations would spontaneously erupt throughout a warrior's body without warning or apparent cause. One moment a Thousand Suns legionary would be fighting normally. The next his armour would split as tentacles burst from his torso, or his head would multiply into several screaming faces, or his flesh would simply dissolve into protoplasmic ooze. Their Primarch Magnus the Red made a bargain with Tzeentch to halt the flesh change, believing he had secured his legion's survival. Instead, he had merely deferred payment. When the Thousand Suns fled to the planet of sorcerers in the Eye of Terror, the flesh change returned with catastrophic intensity. In desperation, the Legion's chief librarian Ahriman cast what became known as the Rubric of Ahriman, a spell of unprecedented power designed to halt mutations permanently. It succeeded, but at terrible cost. All Thousand Suns lacking psychic ability were reduced to dust, their souls drawn into the warp while their empty armour remained standing, animated by residual magic into mindless automatons. The sorcerers who survived retained their minds and power, but found themselves commanding armies of hollow shells, brothers they had killed trying to save. The surviving Thousand Suns bear mutations that reflect Tzeentch's nature. Eyes multiply across their bodies, each one granting visions of possible futures or insights into forbidden lore. Limbs transform into tentacles better suited for manipulating arcane energies. Flesh takes on unnatural colours, blues and golds and purples that shift and change moment to moment. Wings sprout from shoulders, granting flight but marking the bearer as forever transformed beyond humanity. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, offers transformations defined by excess and perfection. Space Marines who fall to the She Who Thirsts find their senses enhanced beyond even transhuman norms, experiencing reality with such intensity that normal existence becomes unbearable monotony. The Emperor's Children Legion pioneered this path. Before corruption, they were perfectionists, warriors who demanded absolute excellence in all endeavours. They maintained their weapons to impossible standards, practiced combat techniques until every movement achieved aesthetic perfection, turned warfare itself into art form. When their Primarch Fulgrim discovered and wielded a demon-possessed blade, it exposed the Legion to Slaanesh's influence. The demon whispered that true perfection required abandoning all restraint, that the Emperor's rules and regulations prevented the Emperor's children from achieving their full potential. Many believed it. The transformations that followed emphasized beauty twisted into grotesquerie. Skin took on unnatural smoothness and luster, while flesh beneath corrupted into something inhuman. Voices became hypnotically musical even while speaking blasphemies. Warriors grew additional limbs to wield more weapons simultaneously, or to better experience sensations beyond mortal comprehension. Pain and pleasure blurred into a single overwhelming sensation that Slaanesh Marines pursued with addictive desperation. They adorned their armour with excessive decoration, covering every surface with artwork and iconography that offended the eye while simultaneously compelling attention. In battle they fought with grace and precision that bordered on dance, movements so fluid they seemed almost choreographed. Yet this aesthetic perfection served slaughter, creating warriors who could carve through enemy formations with horrifying efficiency while experiencing orgasmic pleasure from every wound inflicted and received. Not all corrupted Space Marines dedicate themselves to single gods. Many serve chaos undivided, either worshipping all four ruinous powers equally or simply using warp energy as a tool without theological commitment. These warriors experience more varied mutations, their bodies responding to whatever aspect of chaos they encounter most strongly at any given moment. A warrior fighting cornet demons might develop brass-tinted skin and increased aggression. The same marine battling Nurgle's forces might subsequently manifest resistance to disease and unnatural durability. This flexibility makes Chaos Undivided followers difficult to predict, but also prevents them from receiving the focused blessings that dedicated servants enjoy. They are generalists, in a reality that increasingly rewards specialization. The speed of transformation depends heavily on exposure and acceptance. Space Marines stationed in real space, even if declared heretic and hunted by Imperial forces, may maintain relatively normal appearance for years if they avoid prolonged warp exposure. Their corruption remains primarily spiritual rather than physical, manifesting as moral decay and embrace of methods they once considered heretical rather than obvious mutation. These warriors often retain enough humanity to pass for loyal Astartes from a distance, allowing them to operate in Imperial space longer than more obviously corrupted kin. However, once they enter the Eye of Terror or other regions where the warp bleeds into reality, transformation accelerates dramatically. The temporal instability of the warp compounds this effect. A warband might enter the Eye of Terror and emerge what seems like days later to find decades or centuries have passed in real space. Conversely, they might experience what feels like years of warfare while only hours transpire outside. This temporal distortion means exposure duration is subjective rather than objective. A Space Marine who spends what he perceives as 3 months fighting demon incursions within the Eye might accumulate warp exposure equivalent to 30 years of normal space operation. His body responds accordingly, mutations that should take decades erupting in concentrated bursts of transformation. Individual willpower also determines transformation speed and extent. The Night Lord's Legion demonstrates this resistance. These warriors turned traitor during the Horus Heresy, not because they believed in chaos, but because they rejected the Imperium's hypocrisy and lies. They used terror tactics and brutal methods the Emperor had supposedly forbidden, yet they never worshipped the Dark Gods. Even after 10,000 years operating from the Eye of Terror, many Night Lords remain relatively unmutated. They view obvious corruption as weakness, sign that a warrior has surrendered control to forces beyond himself. Their Primarch Conrad Kurz taught them to be practical above all else, to use whatever tools achieve victory without becoming tools themselves. This philosophy creates warriors who wield demonic weapons without letting those weapons' entities dominate them, who summon warp entities without pledging their souls, who treat chaos as ammunition rather than salvation. Similarly, the Iron Warriors approach corruption pragmatically. Their Primarch Perturabo valued logic and efficiency, qualities his sons maintain even in heresy. They use chaos when it serves their purposes, but resist allowing it to reshape them fundamentally. This attitude provides some protection against unwanted mutation, as transformation seems to require some degree of acceptance or surrender. Warriors who constantly resist the warp's influence, who view mutations as undesired side effects rather than gifts, experience slower corruption even with equivalent exposure. However, this resistance carries its own costs. The constant mental effort required to maintain control while surrounded by warp energies creates psychological strain that eventually breaks all but the strongest wills. The worst fate awaiting corrupted Space Marines is transformation into Chaos Spawn. These creatures represent complete failure, warriors who accumulated mutations beyond their body's capacity to maintain coherent form. The human genome, even enhanced through Space Marine implantation and gene seed modification, can only sustain limited changes before the underlying biological structure collapses. Each mutation stresses this structure further. A warrior might gain brass skin and horns, then tentacles, then additional arms, then eyes across his torso, each change building upon previous modifications. Eventually, the accumulated changes reach critical mass. The body can no longer maintain single unified form. Flesh begins mutating continuously, sprouting new appendages, growing and shrinking random organs, changing shape moment to moment without coherent pattern. The mind fragments under the biological chaos, consciousness dissolving into pure animal instinct. Chaos Spawn are tragic mockeries of their former selves. These creatures retain some physical power, often growing to massive size and developing natural weapons like claws, fangs, or acidic secretions. In combat, they can be dangerous through sheer unpredictability and resilience, but they possess no intelligence, no tactical awareness, no memory of what they once were. Chaos warbands view spawndom as the ultimate humiliation, fate worse than death, because it represents absolute failure in the eyes of the dark gods. A warrior who becomes spawn has been judged unworthy of continued existence, yet denied even the mercy of death, trapped in perpetual torment of uncontrolled mutation. Former battle brothers will sometimes herd spawn into battle as living weapons, or use them as disposable shock troops. More often, spawn are simply abandoned, left to wander demon worlds until starvation or violence ends their miserable existence. The psychological transformation accompanying physical mutation proves equally profound. Space Marine conditioning is designed to make warriors resistant to fear, doubt, and despair. The chaplains of each chapter maintain spiritual discipline, ensuring Marines remain loyal to the Emperor and committed to their chapter's ideals, but corruption undermines this conditioning systematically. The Whispers of Chaos target specific psychological vulnerabilities unique to Space Marines. These warriors were created to be superior to ordinary humans, their genetic enhancement and extensive modification making them transhuman rather than merely superhuman. This creates inherent tension. Space Marines are told they exist to protect humanity, while simultaneously being separated from humanity by every aspect of their existence. They cannot relate to normal humans as peers, cannot form normal social bonds, cannot even reproduce in the biological sense. They are sterile guardians, watching over a species they no longer fully belong to. Chaos exploits this isolation. It whispers that Space Marines deserve to rule rather than serve, that their superiority should be acknowledged with power rather than hidden behind oaths of humility. For warriors who have spent centuries fighting endless wars to protect populations that will never truly appreciate their sacrifice, these whispers find fertile ground. The Night Lords embrace this logic early, rejecting the Emperor's claim that terror tactics and brutal suppression were somehow more evil than the genocides committed during the Great Crusade under prettier banners. If the Imperium was built on violence and dominated by threat of annihilation, why pretend otherwise? Why not embrace the truth of power and use it honestly? Similarly, Chaos targets the Space Marines' relationship with faith. The Emperor explicitly forbade worship of himself, insisting that humanity needed secular truth rather than religious superstition. Yet the Imperium he built became the most oppressively theocratic regime imaginable, with the Emperor worshipped as god by trillions despite his own stated opposition. Space Marines, created before the rise of the Imperial cult, remember the Emperor's actual teachings. They know he rejected divinity. When the Imperium demands they defend a religious order he would have despised, it creates cognitive dissonance that corruption exploits. The Word-Bearers exemplify this vulnerability. They were the most religious legion even before the heresy, believing fervently that the Emperor deserved worship. When he punished them for this devotion, destroying their greatest works and publicly humiliating their Primarch, it shattered their faith not in the concept of gods but in the Emperor's worthiness of worship. They sought other gods to fill that need, and Chaos provided for. The transformation also affects how corrupted Marines perceive reality itself. Extended warp exposure changes neurological structures, altering how the brain processes sensory information. Colours become more vivid, or shift into spectrum ranges humans cannot normally perceive. Sounds carry meanings beyond mere words, conveying emotions and concepts directly to the listener's mind. Time feels less linear, with past and future bleeding into present in ways that make conventional causality seem quaint. These changes grant certain advantages. A Chaos sorcerer who perceives time less rigidly can sometimes glimpse future events or retroactively understand choices that haven't yet occurred, but they also make operating in normal reality difficult. A warrior whose senses have adapted to the Eye of Terror's mutability finds real space oppressively rigid and limited, like a painter forced to work in only black and white after experiencing full colour spectrum. Life as a renegade, hunted by both the Imperium and sometimes rival Chaos factions, creates its own pressures distinct from those faced by loyal chapters. Renegade Space Marines lack the support infrastructure that makes chapters sustainable. Fortress monasteries provide recruitment centres where new aspirants can be tested and implanted with gene seed. Forge worlds supply weapons, ammunition, and replacement armour. Imperial supply lines ensure food for support personnel, fuel for ships, spare parts for vehicles. Renegades have none of this. They must raid for supplies, scavenge battlefields, capture enemy equipment. The Chaos Legions maintain some manufacturing capability within the Eye of Terror, but these corrupted forges produce unreliable goods infected with demonic essence. A bolter forged on a demon world might fire perfectly for years before spontaneously transforming into a serpent or melting into protoplasmic ooze. Armor maintained through warp-touched rituals might provide superior protection, but also develops rudimentary consciousness that argues with its wearer about tactics. Recruitment proves even more problematic. Loyalist chapters carefully screen aspirants, selecting youths who demonstrate appropriate psychological profiles and genetic compatibility. The transformation into a space marine requires years of surgery, implantation, and conditioning, all of which must occur during specific developmental windows. Chaos warbands lack the time and resources for this careful process. Instead, they raid Imperial worlds, capturing children and forcing brutal accelerated implantation. Many candidates die during the process. Those who survive often suffer complications from rushed gene seed cultivation or incomplete neurological conditioning. Some warbands simply steal gene seed from loyalist chapters, implanting it into slaves taken during piracy operations. This creates space marines whose loyalty is ensured through brutality and indoctrination, rather than genuine belief. Such warriors function adequately in combat but prove unreliable when stress tests their commitment. The political structure of renegade warbands further complicates survival. Loyalist chapters maintain strict hierarchical organization, with chapter masters commanding through authority granted by tradition and the Emperor's mandate. Chaos warbands follow might makes right philosophy. Leadership belongs to whoever can claim and hold it through personal power. This creates constant internal conflict as ambitious champions challenge established leaders, seeking to prove themselves worthy of greater authority. These challenges serve Khorne's appetite for violence and Tzeentch's love of scheming, but they also weaken warbands militarily. A force that loses significant warriors to internal power struggles before engaging external enemies starts each campaign at reduced strength. Yet despite these hardships, some renegades thrive. The most successful adapt to their circumstances, developing capabilities their loyalist counterparts lack. Operating outside Imperial law frees them from doctrinal constraints that limit tactical options. They can ally with Xenos species when strategically advantageous, something loyalist chapters cannot do without risking censure. They can employ forbidden weapons and techniques banned by the Codex Astartes. They can strike targets that would politically complicate loyalist intervention. This flexibility, combined with desperation born of knowing they can never return to Imperial grace, makes renegade warbands dangerous opponents despite their limited resources. At the apex of corruption stands the possibility of ascension to Demon Prince, the ultimate reward for successful servants of chaos. This transformation represents complete apotheosis, the mortal soul permanently fused with warp energy to create an immortal entity that is no longer truly alive but cannot die in any permanent sense. Demon princes retain their intelligence, tactical knowledge, and personality while gaining power that rivals greater demons. They can manifest in real space without being bound to specific rituals or conditions. They command mortal followers and demonic entities alike. Most importantly, they have transcended death itself. A demon prince slain in real space simply dissipates, its essence returning to the warp where it reforms over time, usually within 1,000 years, though powerful princes may return much sooner. The path to demon princedom requires accomplishments that attract the personal attention of a chaos god. For Khorne, this means endless slaughter on scale that satisfies the blood god's insatiable appetite for violence. The ascended warrior must have claimed millions of skulls, led campaigns that devastated entire sectors, personally defeated champions and heroes in single combat. For Nurgle, ascension requires spreading plague and entropy across vast regions, corrupting not just bodies but souls, demonstrating understanding that decay is inevitable and accepting rather than resisting this fundamental truth. Tzeentch demands intricate schemes that alter the course of civilizations, manipulation that spans centuries and achieves goals so complex even the schemers sometimes forget their original purpose. Slaanesh requires excess beyond mortal comprehension, experiences so intense they reshape reality. Perfection pursued to such extremes it loops back to become monstrous. The transformation into Demon Prince is both agony and ecstasy. The physical body undergoes final catastrophic mutation, growing to enormous size while incorporating demonic essence directly into its structure. Flesh becomes something between matter and energy, solid enough to interact with physical reality but suffused with warp power. Wings sprout for those dedicated to Tzeentch or Slanesh, granting flight. Additional limbs emerge for wielding more weapons or casting multiple spells simultaneously. The face might retain recognizably human features or transform entirely into something demonic. Horns, scales, tentacles, claws, all manifest according to the Ascended Champion's nature and their patron god's preferences. Most critically, the soul undergoes transformation matching the body. What was once a mortal consciousness becomes something greater and lesser simultaneously. Greater because it now perceives reality from perspective beyond 3 dimensions and linear time. Lesser because it has surrendered ultimate autonomy, becoming an extension of its patron god rather than truly independent entity. Demon princes tell themselves they have achieved immortality and power beyond mortal limits. The truth is more complex. They have become pawns in games played by entities whose motivations remain incomprehensible even to their most favoured servants. The ratio of successful ascensions to failures tells grim story. For every space marine who achieves demon princedom, hundreds or thousands become chaos spawn. The dark gods are capricious, granting ascension based on criteria that seem arbitrary to mortal observers. A champion who serves faithfully for centuries might be cast aside into spawndom, while a relative newcomer receives elevation. Sometimes the gods simply grow bored with a particular servant and discard them like broken toys. Other times ascension is offered as reward but proves to be test, and those who accept too eagerly find themselves transformed into spawn rather than princes. The uncertainty itself serves chaos's purposes, keeping champions desperate and motivated, always striving for that final elevation while knowing it might never come. The tragedy of the corrupted space marine is that they were designed to be incorruptible. Every aspect of their creation was intended to produce warriors who could resist the temptations that broke lesser men. Their genetic engineering strengthened not just bodies but minds. Their conditioning emphasized duty and self-sacrifice. Their indoctrination focused on the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. Yet for all this preparation, space marines prove as vulnerable to chaos as any human, perhaps more so because their transhuman nature makes them more valuable targets. The Dark Gods invest enormous effort corrupting Astartes because successfully turned space marines serve as champions capable of achieving objectives impossible for mortal cultists. In the end, the declaration of heresy begins a process that rarely ends well. Some renegades cling to their humanity for decades, fighting to maintain who they were against inevitable corruption. Others embrace transformation, seeking power and glory regardless of cost. A fortunate few achieve demon princedom, transcending mortality at the price of their souls. Most devolve into mindless spawn, their potential wasted, their sacrifice forgotten, and all of them, regardless of final fate, serve as warnings to loyalist chapters. Heresy is not abstract theological failure, but concrete biological and psychological transformation. Once it begins, stopping proves nearly impossible. The wisest response remains what the Imperium practices: immediate, total purging of any hint of corruption before it can spread. Better to lose 1,000 loyal warriors to overcautious execution than allow a single truly corrupted marine to survive long enough to become the monster all heretics eventually become.